Welcome survivors to Survival Horror Ambiance, where the undead roam and the living fight to see another dawn. Tonight, we're diving into the harrowing tale of Peter Lashley, an Army veteran stationed at the CDC. Peter is tasked with protecting what's left of humanity's hope, while facing impossible choices and overwhelming odds. This is a story of sacrifice, betrayal, and survival at any cost. You won't want to miss a single moment of this chilling 5-chapter saga. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Survival Horror Ambiance for more gripping tales of terror and survival. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you're always ready for what's lurking in the shadows. The sun bore down relentlessly, casting shimmering waves over the cracked asphalt outside the CDC. Peter Lashley adjusted the strap of his rifle, the heat pressing down like a heavy weight. Beyond the chain-link fence, a sea of makeshift tents stretched out, filled with weary survivors. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, their voices rising in a steady murmur of pleading and frustration. "You think they'll ever stop coming?" Corporal Jameson asked beside him, swiping a sleeve across his freckled face. Peter shook his head. "Not anytime soon." A distant shout echoed from the far end of the encampment. Another commotion, another desperate moment. Peter forced himself to stay focused, his gaze forward. It wasn't easy, not with families clustered near the fence, parents holding their children close, eyes filled with silent questions. But orders were orders. Only CDC personnel and authorized officials were allowed inside, and even their numbers were dwindling. Inside the CDCs, the air was crisp and controlled, a stark contrast to the world beyond the fence. Peter preferred standing watch, even if it meant enduring the heat and the weight of the situation. Out here, at least he understood the rules. Lashley. Lieutenant Carter's sharp voice pulled him from his thoughts. The man carried authority in his stance. Inside. Briefing in 5. Peter sighed, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "Watch your 6, he said to Jameson, who gave him a tight nod. The CDC halls were eerily quiet, punctuated only by the soft hum of fluorescent lights. They'd lost power to most of the building a few days ago, and the backup generators were running on fumes. Peter passed a group of scientists in lab coats huddled in whispered conversation, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. Sophie was among them. She looked up as he approached, her brown eyes locking onto his. For a moment, the tension in his shoulders eased. Sophie had that effect on him, a kind of quiet strength that made him believe, even for a second, that all this wasn't for nothing. "You doing okay?" he asked, his voice lower than it needed to be. She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "As okay as anyone can be. They're not telling us everything, you know." Peter smirked humorlessly. "That's the Army's specialty. You need anything?" She shook her head, but her hand brushed his as she stepped closer. "Be careful out there, Peter." He nodded, the warmth of her touch lingering as he headed to the briefing room. Lieutenant Carter didn't sugarcoat things. "Ammo's low. Real low. We've got maybe a week left if we're lucky. Reinforcements aren't coming, and command's gone dark. As far as we're concerned. This post is it, last line of defense for the CDC." Peter leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "What happens when we run out of bullets?" Carter's jaw tightened. "We don't." The room fell silent, the weight of the unspoken crushing down on everyone. "Keep the perimeter tight," Carter continued. "No one gets in. No exceptions. Dismissed." That night, Peter was back on patrol. The camp outside the fence was louder now, arguments breaking out among the survivors. Someone was crying, a low, guttural sound that grated on his nerves. "Think they're going to try to rush the fence?" Jameson asked, his voice shaky. "Maybe," Peter admitted. "Doesn't matter. We hold the line." A rustling sound caught his attention. Beyond the campfires, a lone figure stumbled out of the shadows. Peter raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Stop," he barked. "Show me your hands." The figure groaned, its head snapping toward him. Pale, bloodied, and shambling. The telltale signs were all there. Walker. Peter lined up the shot and fired. The crack of the rifle echoed into the night, silencing the camp for a moment before chaos erupted. "They're getting closer," Jameson muttered. "Let 'em try," Peter said, reloading. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. Chapter 2. Cracks in the wall. The morning sun rose like a judgment, harsh and unforgiving, casting long shadows over the fence where survivors huddled in clumps. Some were quiet, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Others shouted and pleaded, their voices hoarse with desperation. Peter leaned against the rusted gate, watching as a woman cradled a toddler who looked too weak to lift his head. He took a sip from his canteen, the warm water doing nothing to ease the knot in his stomach. The toddler's head lolled unnaturally, and Peter's grip tightened on his rifle. He couldn't let himself care. Caring got you killed. "Hey, Lashley," Jameson called from the tower above. "Got some movement about 50 yards out." Peter squinted toward the tree line. A small group of figures emerged, 5 or 6 of them. Survivors. At least he hoped so. "Carter said no one gets in," Jameson reminded him. Peter nodded. "I know the orders." The group moved closer, waving their arms and calling out. "Please, we need help. We've got kids." "Always with the kids," Jameson muttered under his breath. Peter raised his rifle but didn't aim. "Stop where you are." The group halted, fear and desperation etched on their faces. A man in the lead stepped forward, holding up his hands. "Got food to trade," the man called out, his voice strained. "Please. My wife is sick. She needs a doctor." Peter met the man's pleading gaze, a familiar look of desperation etched into his face. It was always hard seeing hope where there was none to give. "I'm sorry," Peter said, keeping his voice steady. "I don't have the authority to let anyone in." The man's shoulders slumped, but then he dropped to his knees, hands clasped. "Just her, then. My wife. You don't have to take the rest of us, please." Peter hesitated, his stomach twisting, but his orders were clear. "I wish I could, but the policy is strict. You need to step back." A woman in the group let out a frustrated cry. "This isn't right." Jameson's voice crackled through the radio. "Lashley, just be careful. We don't know if they're carrying anything." Peter signaled his acknowledgement, but the group still lingered. "Please, just step back," he urged, his tone firm but not harsh. The man exhaled shakily, shaking his head. "You think that fence is the answer? You think any of us are really safe?" Before Peter could respond, a loud noise split the air. A warning shot from the tower. The group startled, fear flashing across their faces. "Nobody wants trouble," Peter said quickly, trying to diffuse the tension. The group hesitated, then slowly backed away, retreating into the camp. Peter let out a quiet breath, but the weight of it all still pressed down on him. Inside the CDC, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Sophie was hunched over a microscope when Peter found her. "You okay?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. She didn't look up. "No one's okay, Peter. You've been at this for hours." She finally turned, exhaustion in her eyes. "I have to keep going. If we don't figure this out, nothing else will matter." Peter nodded, his jaw tightening. He stepped closer, his voice softening. "You're doing all you can, more than most." She let out a bitter laugh. "You think that matters? Every time we think we're close to something, the data doesn't add up. This virus, it's like it's rewriting the rules of biology." Peter placed a hand on her shoulder, and for a moment she didn't shrug it off. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly. She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Thanks, Peter. I mean it." That night, the camp outside the fence erupted in chaos. Peter was jolted awake by screams and gunfire. Grabbing his rifle, he sprinted to the perimeter, where Jameson and a handful of other soldiers were already firing into the camp. "What the hell happened?" Peter shouted. "Someone turned." Jameson yelled back, his face pale. "It's spreading like wildfire out there." Peter scanned the camp, his heart sinking. Walkers were everywhere, tearing into the living. People screamed, running in all directions, only to be dragged down and devoured. "Hold the line." Lieutenant Carter's voice bellowed over the comms, but Peter knew the truth. They were losing control. "Jameson, cover me." Peter shouted, hopping the fence before anyone could stop him. "You're insane," Jameson yelled, but his rifle fire followed Peter as he charged into the chaos. A woman screamed nearby, clutching a child as a walker closed in. Peter took aim and fired, the walker's head snapping back as it crumpled to the ground. "Get to the fence," he yelled, hauling them to their feet. All around him, the night was alive with terror. But Peter kept moving, pulling people out of the fray when he could, putting down walkers when he couldn't. The line between survivor and soldier was starting to blur, and Peter wasn't sure how much longer they could hold the wall. Chapter 3. The Fraying Edge. The dawn crept over the CDC compound, dull and gray, casting the encampment outside in a muted light. The makeshift tents and lean-tos looked like gravesites now, bodies scattered among the debris. Some were human. Others were the remnants of walkers, their heads pulped into unrecognizable masses. Peter leaned against the fence, his rifle slung across his chest, exhaustion clinging to him like a second skin. His fingers still trembled from the night's firefight. Jameson approached, rubbing bloodshot eyes. What the hell was that night? Peter shook his head. Containment breaking down. People panicked, someone got bitten, and it all went to hell. Not just people panicking, Jameson said, lowering his voice. That girl they pulled through the gate. She was already turning, Pete. They said she was fine. No bites, no scratches. But by the time Carter checked her, she was gone. He had to put her down himself. Peter's stomach sank. "You're saying?" "I'm saying it's not just bites, man. Maybe it's in the air, the water. Hell, maybe it's just time catching up with us." The implications hit Peter like a gut punch. He glanced toward the CDC building. If that was true, then the people inside weren't as safe as they thought. Inside the CDC, Sophie was pacing in the lab, her movements frantic. Charts and papers littered the counters. The once organized space now a mess of chaos and despair. "We're losing control," she said when Peter walked in. "We never had it," he replied, his voice heavy. She looked up at him, her eyes hollow. "The virus is mutating. It's faster than anything we've ever seen. Even if we find a cure or a vaccine, it won't matter. The spread is exponential." Peter stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Jameson thinks it's already inside. He said a girl turned with no bites." Sophie's face paled. "That can't be right. The infection requires contact, a bite, blood exposure. That's the only way it spreads." "Then explain it," Peter said sharply. She couldn't. Mood in the barracks was grim. Soldiers sat in small groups, their conversations hushed. A few polished their rifles with mechanical precision. Others stared at nothing, their minds elsewhere. "Lashley." Lieutenant Carter's voice cut through the room. "I need a word." Peter followed him to a corner where the lieutenant leaned in close. "We're running on fumes, Lashley. Ammo's down to a couple hundred rounds, rations are nearly gone, and morale's shot to hell." "We're soldiers, Carter," Peter said. "We don't get the luxury of low morale." Carter's eyes narrowed. "That attitude's not going to hold the line. We're barely keeping the walkers out, and now there's talk in the ranks. People thinking about cutting loose, heading out on their own." "Let them try," Peter said, his voice cold. "The world out there's worse than in here." "Maybe," Carter said. "But if this place falls, there's no backup, no reinforcements. Just us." Peter didn't need reminding. That night, the survivors outside the fence were eerily quiet. The usual sounds, arguments, crying, pleading, had faded into a low murmur. Peter was on patrol when he spotted a figure moving among the tents. It wasn't shambling like a walker, but darting from shadow to shadow. "Jameson," he hissed into his radio. "You see that?" "Yeah," Jameson replied. "Could be a scavenger." Peter crept closer, his boots silent on the dirt. He rounded a corner and came face to face with a man, his eyes wild, a knife clutched in his hand. "Don't move," Peter said, aiming his rifle. The man froze, his chest heaving. "I wasn't stealing, I swear. Just looking for my wife. She's sick. I think she's inside." "There's no one inside for you," Peter said, keeping his rifle steady. The man's expression twisted into despair, then anger. "You don't care about us. You sit in there, safe, while we rot out here. You're cowards." Peter didn't flinch. "Back off." "Now." The man hesitated, then darted away into the night. Peter didn't follow. By the time Peter returned to the CDC perimeter, something felt off. He spotted Jameson on the wall, staring intently into the camp. "What's wrong?" Peter asked. Jameson pointed. "That campfire over there. No one's moving. It looks off." Peter lifted his binoculars. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows over the motionless figures around it. They were too still. Unnaturally so. A sense of unease crept over him. Something's not right. Then one of them moved. A slow, stiff twitch. Another followed. Then another. Peter's stomach tightened. "Get the alarm ready." The stillness shattered as the figures lurched forward, drawn by the lights now flaring to life. "We've got movement," Peter called out as soldiers rushed to position. The camp erupted in chaos. Shapes surged toward the fence, relentless and unyielding. Peter took a steadying breath, gripping his rifle. Here we go again. The first warning shot rang out, cutting through the night, and the battle for survival began once more. Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. The fence trembled under the relentless assault. The groans of walkers mixed with the panicked shouts of soldiers and the crack of rifle fire. Peter stood at the edge of chaos, his rifle kicking against his shoulder as he fired shot after shot. Beside him, Jameson reloaded with a speed born of sheer desperation. "They just keep coming," Jameson yelled, sweat streaming down his face. Peter didn't answer. He was focused, counting his shots. 7, 8, 9. He slapped a new magazine into his rifle and kept firing. The floodlights bathed the scene in harsh, artificial light. The walkers surged in waves, trampling the corpses of their own as they pressed against the barrier. Soldiers on the line barked orders, their voices tinged with fear. "Jameson, watch the left," Peter shouted. A soldier screamed, his rifle clattering to the ground as a walker grabbed his arm through the fence. Peter turned and fired, the shot punching through the walker's skull and splattering the soldier with gore. "Get it together," Peter barked. but it was getting harder to keep things together. The soldiers were running out of bullets. Worse, they were running out of hope. Inside the CDC, Sophie and the other scientists huddled in a secure lab, the walls shaking with the distant sounds of chaos. "We can't stay here," one of them said, his voice high with panic. "If that fence goes down, we're safer here than out there," Sophie snapped. "Are we?" the man countered. "If the soldiers can't hold the line, what happens then? We'll be stuck in here with no way out." Sophie gripped the counter, trying to steady herself. Her thoughts drifted to Peter, out there doing everything he could to protect them, to the people outside waiting, hoping, and to the quiet rumors among the soldiers that the situation might already be worse than they realized. Peter pushed back against one of the infected, using the weight of his rifle to keep it away. His ammunition was low. He needed to regroup, fall back to the second line. Carter's voice rang out over the commotion. Peter grabbed Jameson's shoulder, guiding him back as the others repositioned. "Where's Carter?" Peter asked, scanning the scene. Jameson's face was solemn. He didn't make it. He held them off as long as he could. Peter swallowed hard, but there was no time to process it now. By dawn, the movement outside had slowed. A few figures still lingered beyond the fence, but the worst had passed. The remaining soldiers were drained, their uniforms streaked with dust and sweat. Peter leaned against a supply crate, taking a moment to catch his breath as he checked his gear. "That was close," Jameson murmured. Peter exhaled, his expression tense. "It's not over yet. This was just the start." Jameson said nothing, but he didn't argue. Inside the CDC, Sophie paced the lab, her mind racing. The others sat quietly, each lost in their own thoughts. She turned back to the microscope, remembering what she had seen in the latest sample. A slight but undeniable change in the virus. The realization settled in. Taking a breath, she reached for the radio. "Peter," his voice crackled through. "Yeah, we need to talk. Now." Peter met Sophie in the corridor, his boots heavy on the tiled floor. She looked at him, her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. "It's airborne," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter stared at her. "What?" "The virus. It's mutating. It's not just bites anymore." Peter felt the weight of her words settle over him like a shroud. "How long have you known?" "Since yesterday." "I wasn't sure until now." Peter clenched his fists. "You should have told me." "What difference would it have made?" Sophie snapped. "We're all dead anyway." Peter stepped back, the anger draining out of him. She was right. Before he could respond, a distant scream echoed through the building. Peter and Sophie exchanged a look. "Stay here," he said, grabbing his rifle. "Like hell I will," Sophie said, grabbing a pistol from a nearby table. The scream led them to the loading bay, where they found two soldiers wrestling with a figure on the ground. The woman's face was pale, her eyes sunken, her teeth snapping at anything within reach. She turned. One of the soldiers shouted. She just turned. Peter raised his rifle. "Move." The soldiers scrambled back, and Peter fired, the shot echoing through the cavernous space. Sophie knelt by the body, her face pale. "She was fine yesterday," she whispered. Chapter 5. The last stand. Peter's hands ached, his grip on the rifle uncertain. His breaths were quick, uneven, as he listened to the low, growing murmurs from down the hall. Movement in the shadows. "Too many." "Jameson," Peter said without turning. His voice was steady, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "You still have that grenade?" Jameson nodded, pressing a hand to the cut on his forehead. "Two left. Use them wisely. No point holding back now." For a moment, their eyes met, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The lab was in chaos. Sophie hurriedly gathered files, stuffing them into a bag with trembling hands. Under her breath, she muttered to herself, frustration spilling out in quiet words. "You ready?" Peter asked, pushing through the door. She flinched, her wide eyes locking onto his. "Almost. I have the sample." "Good," Peter said, his tone firm but measured. "Because we're out of time." Jameson stumbled in behind him, his rifle clutched tightly. "They're getting through. We don't have long." Sophie exhaled, trying to steady herself. "What's the plan?" Peter met her gaze, his expression resolute. "We get you out of here. That's all that matters." Screams started just as they made it to the central corridor. Survivors, some from the camp outside, others who'd wandered in through broken gates, were overrun, their desperate cries fading into wet, choking sounds. Peter didn't look. He couldn't. "Keep moving," he barked, shoving Sophie ahead of him. Behind them, Jameson pulled the pin on a grenade and hurled it down the hallway. The explosion rocked the building, sending a cloud of dust and viscera into the air. "That'll buy us a few seconds," Jameson muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. They reached the main entrance. A massive steel door now warped and useless. The walkers were pouring in through gaps, their dead faces blank, their jaws snapping hungrily. "Here," Peter shouted, spotting an emergency stairwell. He shoved Sophie toward it. "I can't," she started, but he cut her off. "You can. Go." The stairwell was narrow, the walls streaked with blood. Sophie stumbled up the steps, clutching the vial of the virus sample so tightly her fingers ached. Peter and Jameson were right behind her, their boots echoing against the concrete. At the top of the stairs, Peter yanked open a door, and they spilled into the upper level of the CDC. It was quiet here. Too quiet. "They're coming," Jameson said, his voice grim. Peter nodded. "We hold them off here. Sophie, you get to the roof. Signal the chopper," Sophie said, her voice cracking. "There's no chopper," Sophie said, her voice cracking. "There's always a chopper," Peter snapped. "You just have to believe it's coming." She stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. "And what about you?" Peter didn't answer. When the walkers came, it was like a flood. Peter and Jameson stood side by side, firing until their rifles clicked empty, then swinging their weapons like clubs. "Peter!" Jameson shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Peter turned just in time to see a walker sink its teeth into Jameson's neck. Blood sprayed, and Jameson fell, gurgling a curse as he pulled his last grenade. "Go out swinging," he muttered, and then the explosion lit up the room. Sophie was on the roof when she heard it, the blast that shook the building beneath her feet. She clutched the vial, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Peter burst through the door moments later, his face pale, his arm bleeding. "Are you bit?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," he said, but his eyes flickered away from hers. She knew he was lying. "They're coming," he said, stepping past her to the edge of the roof. He scanned the horizon, his expression hard. "No chopper, huh?" Sophie didn't answer. Peter turned to her, his face softening. "You need to go. Find another way. Find someone who can do something with that." He nodded toward the vial in her hands. "What about you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled faintly. "Guess I'll hold the line." Sophie stared at him, torn between running and staying. "I can't leave you." "You can," he said firmly. "And you will. Now go." She ran. The stairs blurred beneath her feet as she descended, the vial clutched to her chest. She didn't look back. She couldn't. When she reached the ground, the camp outside was in ruins. Walkers everywhere, tearing into the living. She weaved through the chaos, her mind blank except for one thought. Keep moving. Peter stood alone. The walkers were closing in, their moans growing into a dreadful chorus. He tightened his grip on his rifle, his body weary from exhaustion. And something deeper, colder creeping through him. He thought of Sophie, the way she'd smiled at his bad jokes during the rare moments of quiet, the life he had once imagined, one where the world hadn't fallen apart. Then he moved. With a determined cry, Peter charged into the swarm. His rifle struck, his fists followed, every movement defiant. Even as pain lanced through him, as hands clawed and pulled, he didn't stop. He fought until there was nothing left. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to Survival Horror Ambiance. We have many more tales waiting for you, stories that will chill your bones and haunt your dreams. Share this video with fellow survivors, and let us know in the comments which story you want to hear next. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and always keep an eye on the shadows. You never know what's waiting there.